Welcome to our study in Back from the Future. This is session 4 in our ongoing series, and we're going to take a look at reviewing some of the postmodernist beliefs and precepts. The first precept that we've been studying about came from Francois Lyotard, and it was a disbelief in big stories. His wording was an incredulity towards meta-narratives. And that's just another way of saying a disbelief in large overarching stories that explain everything. And so all of those kinds of concepts are swept aside as invalid or not representing real truth. So obviously the nursery rhyme morals and so forth, any kind of moralization stories, and certainly the Bible are all off the table as being valid explanations of the way the world is or the way the world should be looked at. Also in the second precept here, all is interpretation, Jacques Derrida, one of his chief concepts was the death of the author, the death of the text. It's a disbelief or a lack of reference or need to reference what the author originally intended or what the author originally wrote. Because it's very difficult for a person disconnected from that author or that time of that author to know what was in his mind. It's a skepticism. And so as a result, it's you're free to sort of make up your own meaning. We're going to find this in a motion picture that's come out as of this year that does this very thing. It completely sets aside the traditional story and makes up a story of its own, just simply using the name and some parts of the tradition, but basically rewriting history, you might say. That's pretty popular in the postmodern idea, and so this can invade our churches and has in some cases with what does this scripture mean to you? Now, in innocent usage of it, we have people who are really what they mean by this statement is, how do you feel about this scripture? How does this scripture make you feel? And what is your response to this scripture? That's an innocent question. That's a perfectly normal question. Where the question is used improperly and in a postmodern sense is there's no one here really who can tell you what God meant. And so we don't have that confidence that we can discern that. And so the only thing we're left to do is simply sit around a circle and ask Betty and Ted and Fred what the scripture means to them, and hopefully we will conceive of some meaning that derives out of that process. And of course that leads many Bible studies and study groups astray because people generally don't know what they're talking about in terms of what the original text meant. And it does leave people in this framework that the only thing that's important now is really Christian experience, and that the Word of God is something that's just sort of a guideline. And that's where the danger steps in, that the postmodern influence has caused people in churches to actually do that sort of thing. This is all called deconstruction under Jacques Derrida, and we'll see a little example of this in some films and in other aspects of our session today. So traditional values are swept away. You're the key to all truth and meaning. Facts are irrelevant. It's only what's being interpreted. It's only how you're feeling. If you're being abused, then you're obviously in the right because the people who are abusing you shouldn't be doing so. They must be in the wrong. All of that is based then on how you're interpreting what's happening to you as opposed to the facts. So we want to take a look at a system here of thought for making life's key decisions. These are some of the key decisions that are expected for people to make as they transition from childhood into adulthood. Certainly choosing to take responsibility for your actions and who you are is an important part of that process. Surprisingly today, as kids grow out of childhood, they are used to lying and fibbing about who did what to whom or who stole the cookies, and the result is that they're very used to finding other excuses, other people to blame for their activities, and that can be very disconcerting, especially in the business world and in a workplace where the truth of what went wrong and how things went awry is really what's being driven. And your employers generally do not like people who obfuscate, who prevaricate about their responsibility. So taking responsibility is a good move in moving you towards adult actions and behaviors. Choice about God, obviously for Christians that's an important decision, but the choice can be made either way. What people need to eventually decide is whether God exists, whether he's real or not, and whether his book is a guidepost for their lives. So even people who choose atheism need to have done so with good reasoning. And most of us find that that reasoning is faulty, that the evidence is weighty and substantial in favor of the existence of God, and that he is the God of the Bible. Choices regarding your spouse and marriage, obviously today that's in much jeopardy because many people marry with the caveat or the safeguard that they can always get a divorce if things don't work out. As a result, they never build into their relationship the kinds of skills and attitudes that make for a lasting relationship, and as a result they never understand or perceive those values in their lives. So marriage is a very casual thing in modern life. The choice in a career is also a decision that's important. And by the way, these are not all in chronological order. These can happen in various places and points in one's life. The choice in a career is something that everyone needs to think about because we have a responsibility to take care of our own expenses, to make our own living in the world, and to raise a family. So in that regard, we're going to take a brief look at high schools and colleges because of some of the postmodern thinking and some of the things that are characteristic of college life as parents are thinking about sending their kids to college, or kids are thinking about the college they would like to attend. What are some of the factors that are going to help them make those decisions? And what is the life like there? We're saying here navigating the minefield of colleges and universities, and that's because a lot of things have changed since most of the parents that are listening to this have gone to college. In the past, college, university life is a cherished place for a formal education. And even today, you really can't get the kind of formal training and exposure to topics and ideas without going to college. And so it's a very good way to prepare you for life. And many folks have the same image of that college life based on when they went to school. Things have changed since then so that when their children now go to those same colleges, the atmosphere and the environment is quite different. Also, because it is a cherished place, parents generally think it's worth the expense to scrimp and save and sacrifice in order that their kids' expenses can be taken care of. But when their kids get there, they usually have this kind of an idea about how college life is going to be. You have a teacher with a rather large audience. Everyone's got a smile on their face. Everyone's enjoying. There's probably some humor involved and a good manner of teaching, an effective way of teaching. Everyone's enjoying the learning experience. And in smaller classrooms, they're making friends, making good friends, long-lasting friends. And the overall college and education experience is something that people enjoy. Too often, though, depending on the school they go to, it could be something quite different, perhaps something like the following.
Students at the University of California, Berkeley held a day of protest on Friday to demand the creation of additional safe spaces for transgender and non-white students. And during the protest, they created a human chain to prevent white students from getting to class.
Difference between debate and dialectic. Debate, wait a second. No, it is. Debate means you are trying to win. Dialectic means you are using disagreement to discover what is true. I am not interested in debate. I am interested only in dialectic, which does mean I listen to you and you listen to me.
We don't care what terms you want to speak on. This is not about you.
I'm talking
We are not speaking
all about him.
On terms of white privilege. This is not a discussion. You have lost that one. These racist teachers have got to go. These racist teachers have got to go. These racist teachers have got to go. These racist teachers have got to go.
No, I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to? Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation.
We have a graphic to show our audience at home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them you see here Z or Zim, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or a rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there.
So we see in this particular case, these examples, lots of distractions from the simple business of getting an education. There's attacks on white privilege, a big theme in many colleges, a shutdown of open debate, the desire to be heard but not to allow the other side to speak, hijacking of the process for social justice ends. So you have a lot of social justice warriors that grow up in the university system while they're going to school and become part of the reactionary and radical style of address. Then the imposing of changes on how we even speak, the imposition of transgender pronouns. All of these things are part of those issues that distract a child from getting an education. But let's have a sense of perspective. It really depends on the school that you're going to be going to. Berkeley, UCLA, Yale, Penn State, Wisconsin, Madison are all schools that have these issues on a weekly basis, perhaps. And so they can be something that the child who goes to those schools has to navigate around or try to avoid. And in some cases, it's very difficult to avoid. But to be honest, most of the students in this class are probably going to be going to local schools, the University of Arizona, U of A, or Arizona State University, ASU in Phoenix. And the white privilege, hate speech, Black Lives Matter, Antifa style type demonstrations have not been prevalent here or been noteworthy here. There is a black student union that's on the campus of the University of Arizona, but their demonstrations have been largely peaceful, and there haven't been newsworthy type items coming out of this area of the country. However, because we are so close to the immigration issue here and the LGBTQ caucus, you might say, is growing, it's very likely that by the time one of your children has to go to a college here, they will be facing perhaps some demonstrations or activism on campus with regard to these particular subjects. So we might ask the question, where's this coming from? And the first thing we want to talk about is an underlying systemic problem in a lot of this new generation of activists. The people that are coming out of high school and junior high and so forth, being brought up in modern families, but with lots of social media influence, and the result is a sort of abandonment of the principles of clear and rational thinking. But also from a postmodern standpoint, this is being shunned because it has a traditional ring to it. It's years ago in schools, the traditional approach to training and to teaching was to give folks an understanding of how to put their thoughts together in a rational and clear way. Speech classes, for example, taught you how to put your ideas in a way that was effective, that made your point. Oftentimes in papers that were turned in, you had to demonstrate that you put the ideas together in a rational fashion, that you made the point that you were trying to propose. All of that is swept away, and all that we care about now is how people feel about the topics that they're writing on. So as a result, not too many people today have a real good discipline in rational thinking. As a result, they make up their own principles of logic, and what you're going to see then is a proliferation of absurd conclusions. Absurdities that make sense to them, it all makes sense to them, but it doesn't conform to what we would have as a standard of understanding and reference. It doesn't obtain in an argument. And so these don't, and they don't believe that they have to. In other words, these ideas, their formulation of principles and ideas, don't have to make sense to anyone else but themselves. So in terms of absurd logic, something that was just recently on television, this is Tucker Carlson's show in which he's interviewing Kathy Aru, who's from Catalina Magazine as the publisher. She's both a writer and an activist. And she's in favor of some new initiatives that are sensitive to the feminist side of things and the transgender side of things. And her interest is to help to eradicate the word man from things like cities, city names, company names, and job titles. So obviously a good example from her standpoint would be the mailman. And for a woman or for a transgender, that's an offensive term. That's a sexist term, or it's an identity assault type of term that harkens back to the days when folks were in a more white privileged, white dominant society. Company names like Goldman Sachs have to be changed because the word man would be too offensive. And with a straight face, she was also asked, what about the fact that you're sitting in a studio in Manhattan? And she, with a straight face, said that would have to be changed too. So one of the characteristics of these kinds of approaches is a carelessness as to what the consequences, what the responsibility for their actions might be, what they might invoke, how much cost, how much upheaval in society they might cause. But it's all worth it because the victimized groups are being cared for, being taken care of. Another movement is the establishment or the building of these what they call cry closets in various institutions and businesses. It's for centering yourself and for dispelling uneasy moments, difficult moments, stressful moments. So you go to this kind of a cry closet where you can cry for 3 or 4 minutes, 10 minutes, then go back to work and feel refreshed. And these are being implemented in some places like the University of Utah. But so far hasn't caught on much elsewhere, but the movement is there nonetheless. The third issue, which is quite ridiculous, is asking your baby's permission to change their diaper. This idea is sponsored because your baby needs to get released or freed from the notion that you're aggressing them, that you're dominant over their lives, and that you're going to change their diaper whether they like it or not. Now, this kind of thinking is just silliness, and obviously this is the way that some of the younger generation are caring for or taking up the challenge of various issues. And we might think of it as silly, but in reality, there are two places where these are already being worked out. Implementations of these things are already being worked out. I already mentioned University of Utah, but Purdue University is considering changing the maleness of the terminology and labeling that they have in various documents and signage. So this is really a case of a growing generation that just no longer has to make sense in the traditional way of looking at things. And there are no reasons then for protesting that have to be based on fact. If you try to acquaint a protester with fact, you're simply a hater, you're simply yelled at and labeled and silenced. So who's then enabling this in terms of actions and activists? You have students, of course, as some of the videos that you just saw portray. They are keyed up about these issues just in and of themselves, generally having to do with white privilege or racist type comments, generally from the black side of the student body. And generally these are students who look at the school really as a theater for activism, and some really actually enroll in courses just to be able to do activism. And when necessary, they get their input from Antifa and Black Lives Matter that not only help to organize the protests, but add other issues to the protests. And sadly enough, the other place that is enabling this is the faculty. In other words, the enabling of protests, the initiation of protests, is actually coming from faculty. An example of this is Ward Churchill at University of Colorado. You have Dana Cloud at Syracuse. Then you have Lucia Valdivia from Berkeley, and then also in the Berkeley area, Yvette Velarca is a very famous middle school teacher, been arrested many times, quite a large activist, well known in the California scene. Then from Harvard, you have Kirsten Weld and then Walter Johnson. So those are schools in which this sort of thing is very much initiated by the faculty. So the opinion from most people today is that universities, by and large, throughout our country are left-leaning. So we want to take a moment to understand those terms. You can be a progressive and not necessarily be a leftist. But all leftists generally are progressive. They are liberal progressive. And the difference is that they believe in a radical action to defend the personal rights that they feel are theirs. And then there's accompanying with that is a neglect for personal responsibility. Left-leaning is a lighter term, and it usually means someone who has an approval of the leftist ideals, but doesn't feel strong enough about being radical by obeying or, participating in the activities, the actual debates, the protests and the demonstrations, or the damage of property, as the case may be. So universities and schools are seen to be increasingly more hostile in their atmosphere, and free speech has been redefined, in which it used to be a case where all parties, all groups had an equal access to the microphone. Today, only the victimized groups have a right to the free speech. The reason being that the white privileged folks have already had their say, and there's nothing new that they can bring to the party, so they're disenfranchised from free speech. They don't have a right to exercise it. Same goes for diversity. Diversity is taught in many businesses as being universally applied across the board, but today in universities and schools, diversity only applies to the victimized classes, generally the non-white classes. And the middle class, the white middle class, or white privileged class is excluded. You don't have to extend diversity considerations to them. A new vocabulary of fear also has been coined. These are several of the terms that your young person is going to face. You need to be acquainted with them as parents. But these are terms that are going to come up in news. Some of them are already in the news, and they may even be occurring and being presented and legislated, you might say, in high schools. The first one is identity politics. Politics used to be a case of just the differences of political opinions, social order opinions, and the balance of left and right, conservative and liberal was considered a good thing, and equal time spent and equal understanding spent on both sides. Today, identity politics is basically the way of assigning you a political view, a political statement based on your identity, and that primarily your skin color. So if you're a part of the white privileged class, we already know what your politics are. You don't need to state them. You're going to be judged by the class that you belong to. Latino, feminist groups, same way. We simply judge your politics by the fact of your association or your identity. White privilege, we've already explained a little bit about. It's the idea that this country was established and built by European whites who built it with the idea that white men of privilege, white men of influence and power would be the primary movers and shakers, the reason for the country being built. And the rest of the classes of people, especially those of color, those of ethnic backgrounds different from the European white, were not really worthy of the nation's benefits, that they weren't really intended for them. Many even go so far as to say the Constitution wasn't really written for them or with them in mind. Hate speech is a revised definition. It used to be that anytime you uttered anything of hateful nature, you had to have that component in order to be hateful in your speech. Now, all you have to do is disagree with one's opinion. If you simply disagree or criticize another person's opinion, that's engaging in hate speech. Microaggressions are, as the name implies, they're a different, lighter form of aggression, but they are just as bad in terms of the recipient. Microaggressions are those that are uttered without the intent of being aggressions or offensive. For example, if I ask you where you're from and you happen to have a foreign look to you, a person can take that badly as being a way in which you can separate or discriminate between them because you're identifying them as in a foreign class. Another one that's been famous on television and comedy shows is a Chinese person being asked where the best Chinese restaurant is. That used to be a perfectly legitimate question. Today, it's a microaggression because why? Because I'm Chinese, would I know where all the best Chinese restaurants are? Then you have, in this particular case here, locally, the Daily Wildcat has highlighted that the University of Arizona is writing a handbook on microaggressions. So that'll be published, and then people can study up on the kinds of terms and sentences they might say that might cause someone to feel offended, even though they didn't intend it. Safe spaces is a new idea that's come about in the last maybe decade or so, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, in which universities, administrations, places of business are supposed to provide safe spaces for people who are of the victimized classes, so that if they feel they're being aggressed, they feel they're being discriminated against, or they're exposed to racist prejudice, they can go to these safe spaces where they can release their tensions and their anxieties. Then we come to trigger warnings. A trigger is just another way of saying you've angered someone. You're the one who provides the trigger by saying the speech. And when they feel that way, they react. And so when someone reacts, as this lady here is, she's considered triggered. And today the reactions are much more violent, so the term is actually applied more violently. That is the idea of a trigger. So your responsibility in this is to be able to provide trigger warnings. Just see ahead that you might be saying something that's going to be offensive to a particular group or a particular person, and give them a warning so that they can either leave, walk away, or they can seek their safe space and avoid the confrontation. So those are the terms that your young person is going to face, or if you're the young person listening to this, these are the kind of terms that are going to be part of normal parlance in the university system, in the college system. And they very well may be part of your high school experience. So what's a godly response to all of this? We might say, well, you know, if you just looked at the love of God and the love that's in the Bible, in the gospel and the teachings of Jesus, you wouldn't have all these hang-ups. We wouldn't have to use all these terms. One of the primary difficulties in bringing the gospel testimony into this situation is that it's often characterized as a white man's religion. Even though Jesus was from a colored race, you might say, tan-colored race, not part of the European white race, and was certainly persecuted. It doesn't matter, because Christianity eventually spread to Europe, became the white man's religion, and that which we have in the United States is a direct result of the European expansion of Christianity, not the Jewish expansion. So that would be a reason for rejecting it outright, is you're just asking me to buy into the old white privilege and the religion of the white man. The other thing that, of course, is theologically problematic is, even though God does say that he loves all people and loves all people in all their conditions, we know from the Gospels that he doesn't want people to stay in those conditions. So the gospel calling, come as you are, does not mean and stay as you are. Whereas in the victimized classes, they want to be able to stay as they are and still be loved and appreciated. And the gospel is always interested in moving you from where you are now to where you should be in God's kingdom. So that would be another reason for rejecting it. That doesn't mean that God can't get through to individuals. The key to witnessing is the power of the Spirit. So in talking to anyone, you shouldn't be put off by the fact that there might be an ideological block. Certainly God can break through that. But don't be surprised if there's just wholesale rejection, and if in any particular case it's simply not the case that God is calling them, or they've got a block that just simply will not move. So we want to take a look at a video. This is a video with respect to all of these issues about white privilege, hate speech, racist comments, and so forth. We have a video from Yale University. And here we have a series of black students who have gathered around a student, or actually a faculty representative for one of the houses that the students actually live in, the dorms that they live in. And an email was sent out with respect to Halloween. And the email was suggesting some caution about what kind of dress they should dress up. There might be some offenses. And they took this badly. And so rather than have you pay attention to what was actually said, because the content is kind of difficult to get, the more important thing is the attitudes of people, the attitudes of the students to adult representatives of the college.
Because other people have rights too, not just
walk away. Walk away. He doesn't deserve to be listened to. He doesn't deserve to be listened to.
Unsafe space here for all. Stay quiet. For all students. You understand that? As your position as master, it is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students that live in Silliman. You have not done that. By sending out that email, that goes against your position as master. Do you understand that? Then
no, I don't agree with that.
Then why do you accept the position?
Because
Who fired you?
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down. If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down. It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here. You are not doing that.
You're supposed to be our advocate.
You should be at the event last night when you hear Franco say that she doesn't know how to create a safe space for her freshmen in Silliman. How do you explain that? These freshmen come here, they think this is what Yale is? Do you hear that? They're going to leave. They're going to transfer because you are a poor steward of the community. You should not sleep at night. We're out. We out. You're disgusting.
So the key issues and takeaways from this is the sense of entitlement, which is a new attitude. Years ago, past decades, no student would think about talking to a representative of the school that way, a faculty member especially. But now that's all done away with. The sense of entitlement, sense of taking command of the situation to right a wrong. And if you're a white person and you've made a racial oversight, even if that was unintentional, you've lost all rights to respect. That's the kind of thing that's taking hold in some areas of academia, and it's appalling to see that happen. But there are also some quotes here from administrators and professors in various schools. These are mostly West Coast schools. There's no more this fair and balanced approach to dialogue, to discussing issues, to debating topics. So here's a teacher at San Diego, UC San Diego, teaching both sides of the story is unnecessary. Another teacher saying, why should I teach a point of view that I don't agree with? At UCLA, there's no such thing as capital T, truth. There is no right or wrong, no good or evil. This is actually said by a professor, and it mirrors much of what one of the postmodern thinkers is going to reveal to us a little bit later in this series. Then at Harvard, the same idea is mirrored. There are no absolutes in our moral precepts. Some fascists believe there are. Perjury is not an absolute. So in this person's mind, it's perfectly okay to commit perjury if you have a good reason. And if you happen to believe in absolutes in moral precepts, you're a fascist. So those are the extensions of these people's ideas. So an administrator at UCLA got the message and understood. He understands perfectly well the predicament he's in, but made this statement. Sadly, for those of us who earn our living here as staff, it's professional suicide to engage in free expression. You just would never have thought that a person at UCLA or any of these major colleges would utter a statement like that in this day and age. So let's bring some sanity to this. Not all progressive students really are radicals in the sense that you just seen demonstrated here, but you could find some that are. But the likelihood is that if you keep your nose to the grindstone, and even if you come in contact with progressive students, the chances of them being radical are less than major. And so as a result, you could make many progressive students as friends and go through college without much of a wrinkle. But it's getting to a point where you won't be able to take a stand. Avoid taking a stand. You'll be asked, you'll be put in the crucible of the ideas and put on trial, you might say, for your ideas, depending on how radical and how severe the issues get at a particular school. Common reaction to this from a Christian standpoint, major depression. You might be asking the question, where is there any Christian hope in these affairs? The question that might come up is, so you're telling us all of this, are you asking that we are called then to fight and destroy postmodernism? That might be the indication of all this study. Well, in certain cases, there might be an exception where you are being called to fight and destroy, but in most cases, a student who simply listens to one of these tapes, listens to one of these lectures, and then goes out and thinks they're going to win the argument, you're going to find yourself pretty much outgunned. Because the postmodern worldview, at least in the universities, is heavily entrenched. You've got to have a fairly extensive background in philosophy and in the humanities and in literature to be able to talk about these kinds of affairs intelligently. Now, the one exception I am talking about, of course, is God's special calling. It is possible that God could be putting his hand on your shoulder to say, I'm singling you out. You're the one who's going to be my spokesman, and I'll give you the ammunition. I'll give you the words to speak. That's all very possible. But for the rest of us, it may not be that same calling. So some will be called to do battle. There's no question about it. And there already are some people in the field. Jordan Peterson is at the University of Toronto. Ravi Zacharias is a floating professor, you might say, a floating honorary professor, and speaks at a lot of colleges, has an extensive background in philosophy, and talks on these subjects of postmodernism quite a bit. But of course, their background is there. And so they have the fortitude and the ammunition to speak back to postmodernists and to critique their theories and explain why they're dangerous to our society. So for everyone else, we need to win those really whom God is calling on a one-by-one basis. And that's been the basis of our Christian witness anyway, from time immemorial. It's not a large, usually not a large group calling like a Billy Graham experience. The average Christian normally reaches the lost one person at a time. And if we look at Jesus in the Gospels, we don't see him speaking out in anger. We don't see him forming a protest with protesters and demonstrators behind him. He doesn't rally around the Sanhedrin building and carry signs and so forth. You don't see him speaking out in anger to anyone that disagrees with him. So largely, here's a case of Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount. And in this particular case, he has a large group, but this group is not being formed into a protest rally or a large-scale group of protesters. Each one is being spoken to very, very intimately as an individual. The fact that there are 5,000 there, or several thousand there, is just a side issue. The issue is that his words are being spoken to the heart, and that represents each individual. Also, this one incident here that's often talked about as far as Jesus being a radical, being a protester, Notice that there's no, this is the cleansing of the temple. There's no big group that he has behind him that are assisting him in this. He's totally by himself, and he's doing so in righteous anger. This is declared to be his own house if he's Messiah, if he's the Son of God. He represents the Father in this case, and the Father's cause. And then when this incident is over, he goes back to his normal ministry. Here's a case in which he's actually speaking to those that do hate him, the Pharisees, and he's speaking in a normal tone of voice. He's not angry, he's not animated, he's not prancing around making a public scene, nor is he grouping a bunch of people to pit them one against the other. This is the style of Jesus in the Bible. And of course, he is a one-on-one person. He reaches them one at a time and ministers to us one at a time. And as we witness throughout the world, we usually reach the world one person at a time. So that's the objective. So we want to take now a look at postmodernism and films. There's an example of a film that's just recently come out that shows this sort of insidious principle of deconstruction. Some of you have probably seen the ads for this film. By the time most people watch this film, it's probably out in the theaters. It's Robin Hood, the 2018 edition. And the normal fare for this particular subject is the 13th century story of Robin Hood in the Earl of Locksley, and the Nottingham story, and the famous evil sheriff of Nottingham and so forth. This is the not only the setting, but the style of clothing and the style of life that the famous story is placed in. The way the modern film treats it is this is the Nottingham, and the kinds of reactions and episodes that come out of it. It's a big double-story building with concrete pillars, and it looks like regular factory-style windows, steel girders, and so forth. It doesn't look like the Nottingham of history, and nor does the director or producer think they have to replicate that. Then down in the corner here, you see the pyrotechnic treatment that has to be part of every adventure film. Yet it's in this concrete factory with factory windows at the back, and looks like some kind of metal transom that's running across the top, just like a regular factory in modern times. And then here is Robin Hood himself. And it's very difficult to conceive of him being a 13th century type person, dressed in modern clothing. None of this, of course, is obligatory to the deconstructionist. He doesn't have to pay attention to what the story originally was like. He can simply use the characters to tell a different story if he so desires. Again, death of the author, deconstruction. This is how the story of Robin Hood fares in setting. So we come then to a third precept of postmodernism. Traditional institutions are broken. This was coined by Richard Rorty, who is an American postmodernist. He's not part of the French school, although he's in concert with them. But he grew up here in America, and his philosophical upbringing and his training and so forth is all American. So this idea of institutions being broken is to some extent an agreement that we can make with him, because we ourselves have counted on traditional institutions in our own society as remaining potent and viable, and we're finding that they fail us. Even the presidency of the United States is looked upon in a very different way today than it was, say, even 10 years ago. Even though there were signs of some corruption and foul doing, the whole status and the whole nature of the presidency is being reviewed today. So we might agree. In terms of moral decline, nothing can be more poignant than seeing the exemplification in the decline of TV programming. So we're going to take a look at two different types of programs. The most popular TV show of the 80s, that's a question, and most of the high schoolers listening to this would not be able to name this program because they weren't there. And it's doubtful they've seen many of the previews. It's possible, but back in the 80s, when the parents and grandparents were living and enjoyed television, The Cosby Show was the featured program that was really the most popular show of the 80s, primarily because it was very family-oriented, very morals-based. So as we come to the 90s and we ask the same question, what was the most popular TV show of the 90s? Again, you'll have differences of opinion, but the polls show that the show that came out on top was the show Friends. And that was not so much about family, but more about the friendships that they each had as the characters had. But if you ask a slightly different question, the most influential and important show of the 90s, hands down in terms of the surveys, was Seinfeld. Now, again, you might have a difference of opinion. You might have enjoyed other shows much more than this, but this is the show that seemed to break all the molds and have the most influence in terms of our look towards the future and the moral fabric of our future in society. Let's take a look then at these two programs and some of the differences that they portrayed. Cosby Show was always about family. Family was the main theme of the Cosby Show. And as a result, that was favorable to those particular times. Parents loved having their children sit down and watch this with them because they learned a great deal about family relationships that way. Seinfeld was about friends, and family was secondary. There were only two families really in the Seinfeld show, and they were only occasionally portrayed, and we'll talk about how they were portrayed a little bit later. There were big stories. The meta-narratives that Leotard is so adamant against were very common in the Cosby Show. What's the moral of each episode? In the Seinfeld show, there were no lessons or morals conveyed. If they were done so, they were done so accidentally. But there wasn't an intention to create lessons or morals from each episode. If you did right in the Cosby Show, you were cool. If you did right in the Seinfeld show, you were considered a loser. That's how backwards the logic and thinking was. The Cosby Show was always about something, something that was to be learned by the viewer at the end of the episode. In Seinfeld, they prided themselves in saying it was a show about nothing. Just a slice of life, no great themes to convey, nothing to really report about. In the Cosby Show, family was the solution. They were the go-to organization to solve problems, and they got solved in each episode. In Seinfeld, family was the problem. Family was the difficulty, the problem that had to be worked around, had to be sidestepped. The case in point would be George Costanza's parents. Were always dysfunctional, always arguing, always embarrassing. George always had this kind of expression on his face whenever dealing with his parents. So it just reiterated the notion that the parents in this series were always a problem. So this came to be then seen as a shift from traditional values down to the debunking of values as obsolete, useless, or broken. Debunking just means to make ridiculous, to put down. And so that's very postmodern. That's a very postmodern concept, is these are all the values that are being debunked are the traditional ones from the modernist era. So as we look at the 20th century, four big institutions were featured in the media, in literature, in discussions. They were very present in our society: home, church, state, and schools. And there were representatives of each of these disciplines, these institutions. You have a home with the father. Church was represented by pastors, the state were represented by presidents, and the schools represented by teachers. And in the media, during the first part of the 20th century, they were given very positive play. Father Knows Best on the home side was one of the best shows on television, portrayed the father in a very positive light, a very comforting and wise light. And the teachers, just in real life, teachers were expected to pass along the moral compass to their students. And so that was really an expectation of sending kids to school. In the 90s, these all didn't fare very well. Fathers were seen as abusive, as cheating, as constantly breaking their promises, even to their children. Pastors were seen as megalomaniacs, as money grabbers, always out for money and building an empire. And if they were involved in the solution of some problem, they were always seen as relatively useless. Whatever they offered just did not work. And then presidents were seen as either corrupt or as stooges of a conspiratorial system. Teachers in real life, aside from the media, were bullied by parents. They were seen as people who could be bullied by the parents of children who wanted their child to advance regardless of its performance. They were also assessed as being not much better in terms of education. They might be fairly mediocre in terms of their education compared to the students they were teaching. And also of late, they were part of a system of paid sanctuaries for criminals. Where this came into play is in the recent Parkland shooting incident at the Stoneman Douglas School with Nicholas Cruz. Nicholas Cruz had committed several offenses, dozens in fact, that would have normally landed him in jail or taken him off the school property and abandoned from most schools. But the Obama era policy was to actually pay schools to not prosecute these offenders. And the fact that they had to develop a policy meant that in many, many schools there were such actors, such students. It was the classic problem. What was being described as a school to prison pipeline, and that the Obama administration was interested in doing away with that pipeline, lessening the flow of that pipeline. And so they actually paid large sums of money to schools to help correct that problem. The result, of course, was that Nicholas Cruz finally snapped, and society has now paid the price for that policy. So we see this as sort of government saying, I'm going to put a stop to justice if it interferes with a particular agenda or program that I want to get forward. And that's a crucial juncture for government to take in terms of a step. So we see that institutions really are broken. This is the viewpoint of the postmodernist. The real question is, what do we do with it? We might agree with them, but their recommendations are then trash the institutions. Don't pay any more attention to them. Spend your time establishing new ones. And that's not part of the Christian life. That's not part of the conservative Judeo-Christian ethic in society today. So another precept that we want to look at is no legitimate cultural norms. This was established by our fourth guy, Michel Foucault, who died of AIDS back in 1984. He coined several key phrases that have wound up in various unlikely places, especially one would be the Supreme Court, which you're going to take a look at soon. So no legitimate cultural norms. A cultural norm is really what society agrees to accept as normal behavior. It's not a law. It's a form of society dictating what your behavior should be like. An example would be women exposing their legs and their ankles. At the turn of the century, this was an unacceptable performance in society. It was not illegal. You couldn't be hauled away to jail for doing it, but you could be shunned and made to feel socially unacceptable if you chose to do it anyway. Today, of course, that's all changed. And so the net result is that for Foucault, these things are not legitimate because they are not based on eternal qualities or qualities that continue to abide from a civilization or from culture to culture or even from decade to decade. So there are no cultural norms. He believes that there are in fact cultural norms, so there's just no legitimate ones. That's the key to his phrase here. So cultural norms are power structures. They are ways to constrain behavior. They're ways society can constrain people to behave in a certain way. And he's identifying that as a sort of a problem stemming out of the old moralistic ideas of the modern age from the Renaissance forward, which all of postmodernism is turning over. So it's not legislated through laws, but through social acceptance. And the fear of social disacceptance is what drives people to constrain their behavior. Then we have the statement of truth is an exercise of power. Now, for most of us as Christians, this is This is incongruent. This doesn't make a lot of sense because the truth that we are talking about doesn't try to exercise power. It simply is. It's something to be espoused, something to be sought after, something to be cherished, and it doesn't have an exercising will. So you have to understand that from the postmodern point of view, they don't believe in capital T truth. They believe in all the little t truths. And so in this case, the truths they're talking about that are exercises of power are all the truths that individuals and groups try to legislate. So here are some examples. Truth can be socially constructed. In other words, society can construct its truth and then promulgate that. So coming out is an example of this. A person who came out as gay, say 20 or 30 years ago, was shunned. You might have to go back 50 years ago, but nonetheless, they were considered outcasts, and for that reason, not many people admitted their gay lifestyle or their homosexual inner feelings. Today, on any kind of a TV show with an audience, somebody announces that they're gay. It's a heroic thing. They get a huge applause and cheers. Again, society has changed the rules, has changed the definition of things, and that their truth now is used to sway the public. So another way of thinking of this is this one here for Group A seeking to suppress Group B with their particular truths. An example of this would be the transgender community, which is a minority in our country, using their version of truth to change legislation for everyone. The example would be the gender pronouns. There are some places where these are in fact being legislated. Now, outside the United States, the city of Toronto is making this a criminal offense, that if you refuse to use a person's stated pronoun, you can be arrested and put in jail. In New York City, in our country, it's not down to the individual, but there are some establishments, for example, restaurants, that can be fined as much as $250,000 if they refuse to use the pronoun of preference for a customer. So that's where things are headed.
Emma, hi. You're neither male nor female, right?
That's true. I identify as non-binary, which means that I'm neither male nor female, and correspondent to that, I use the they, them pronoun.
I would absolutely refuse to refer to this woman here, who's clearly a woman, as a they, because for me, that would be imposing an ideological political system. Because she is. If everybody watching this program can see that she is a woman, and that is imposing.
That's your problem. I think that's actually your problem. You're imposing.
No, you are asking me to engage in an ideological political system which I disagree with. I believe we are all male and female.
By what they should be called is imposing an ideological system.
Is this idea that there are differences in the sense of imposition, who has primacy, and therefore who is being imposed upon. Quite a different state of affairs today. Now that particular scene was conducted over in the UK, and you might say, well, those things aren't happening here. Here at the University of Arizona, right here in town, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the faculty are given this encyclical here that asking if they've ever required of their students or asked of their students what pronouns they use, and if not, now's the time to start. So as you can see, this issue is going to be accelerating over time, and guidelines like this are going to get actually even stronger as time goes on. So truth as exercises of power, and even before the ones that are part of the transgender issue, were still seen as exercises of power back when postmodernism was just first getting started. So parents might say such a thing as, it's so because I say so, and the postmodernist thinks of that as controlling how kids behave. It's an act of power. Postmodernist sees this value here. It's true because the Holy Church has the authority to say what's true. That's viewed by postmodernists as controlling what people believe. And in the Episcopal Church, just recently in the headlines, they're considering adding gender-neutral language to, in reference to God throughout the book of prayer. This will eventually fold over into an edition of the Bible that does the same thing. You can just bet on it. But this is, again, paying attention to the agenda of the transgender world and allowing it to sway major areas of our culture. Government is seen as using power in this way. When they say we stand for what is right and what is just, it's just a way of controlling the compliance with the laws. So why care? We have norms and we have laws. It's a difference really between what's absolute and relative. And the reason that's important is if in fact the norms or the truths that we are talking about are absolute, then it makes a difference if we're trying to do away with them, if we're trying to wash them away and make them look relative. So in order to understand this difference, the same is true of relative truth and absolute truth. Let's take a look at the differences between absolute and relative, just to get a basic idea. The definition of an absolute is something that is always true, whereas a relative truth is something that all depends on circumstances. That's why it's called situation ethics at times. It's a way of saying that the truth really depends on the circumstances. Those are two competing ideas. In terms of examples, we certainly would like God's love to be in the category of absolute truth. We don't want to wake up and find out that the circumstances have changed. And God simply says, my love for you really depended on certain things being true. When those things are false, my love goes away. We don't want that to be the case. Also, when you go to court and you're seeking justice from the court, you certainly don't want to hear the judge saying, well, today we're no longer disposed to judging murder or theft, so you're sort of out to lunch with us today. We don't want that to happen. So those are cases where we really depend on things always being true. The cases in which folks rely on relative truths are the idea of telling truth itself, the idea of lying. Most people want the option to lie when it's necessary, when it's indicated. The other case is there are some unjust laws on the books and they want the freedom to be able to disobey those without any liability. So that's the opposing ideas. And when it comes down to why we should care, you'll see an apt application of this in just a few minutes. So the benefits really of absolute truth are already worked out. In terms of God's truth, when you're talking about absolute truth and the Bible, it's God's truth. And those benefits have already been worked out in his kingdom. He's already assured us of those. You follow those truths, you're going to have a happy life. The relative truth category, the benefits are not secured. They are wavering. They are precarious. The consequences from a life of living absolute truth are hardly ever disastrous. In the case of relative truths, they're most frequently disastrous. They most frequently bring about unhappiness. And in terms of the happiness prospect, they are great on the absolute truth side and rather precarious on the relative truth side. So again, I still don't understand why I have to care. And the area that we're going to see that might make a great deal of difference to everyone is the U.S. Supreme Court. And in our next session, we're going to take a look at how postmodernism has invaded the court and what that might mean to you as you look ahead to the stability of our country and even your own rights. So this is to be continued, and we appreciate your interest. Thank you for listening.